Daniel Suarez came on the scene with his first novel, Demon, like a Unix demon, which he self-published for a while and marketed on the internet to such success that actual mainstream publishers eventually picked it up. But he did that back before that was a thing. And since then, he's become a New York Times best-selling author. And I think that's it. That's Daniel. Come on.
It's so great to see you guys. I'm also impressed how many people came during lunch. When I worked in corporate America, I would try to schedule meetings with lunch, but people can bring it in. That's good. So my whole shtick, if you will, is that I write sci-fi thrillers that are heavily based in real science, or real software, real code and logic. And Change Agent is no different. It's a bit of a departure for me in that I'm writing about genetic editing. And it looks like my timing might be good because CRISPR is very much in the news right now. Now, just so I can take a survey here, how many people here are relatively familiar with CRISPR, genetic editing? So that's, okay, I'd say about maybe 25%. And that's actually a much higher percentage than if I was in a random Barnes & Noble. This is a very technical crowd. So I'll just describe it very quickly for those who aren't as familiar. CRISPR is actually an acronym that is not helpful in determining what it's about. Clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats. I know, it's just one of those acronyms where you hear it and you say, okay, that does not help at all. As a matter of fact, I'm more confused. And essentially what CRISPR is back in 2012, some researchers found out that bacteria has a way of modifying its own DNA. It's a part of a bacterial immune system. What they noticed were there were these repeating sections. And for those people who've ever concatenated or parsed text files, it's essentially a delimiter. And they noticed this genetic delimiter, and within it were these varying genetic sequences. And it turns out that what that was a rogues gallery of previous viral infections, sort of a profile. And so what would happen is part of the bacterial cell would go in, retrieve some of these, and then unzip the genetic sequence of the DNA strand of the bacteria, and scan looking for those nefarious characters. And if it found them, it would cut the DNA, cut them out, and then the DNA would reconnect itself. So what the researchers did was they said, well, we see where it has the target. Maybe we can program it to replace after it cuts. And so what they essentially did was they created a search and replace function by leveraging this very ancient immunal process of bacteria. And that became CRISPR. And that's what it means by palindromic repeats. It's those repeating segments where you can tell, okay, that's where the rogues gallery begins. Now, they've already achieved amazing results in the lab using CRISPR. So if genetic editing seems like it's far away, it's not. Just last month, Chinese researchers were able to correct a heritable genetic disorder in a viable human embryo. Now, this embryo was not brought to term, but it would have cured this would-be child. And so, of course, they're looking at a lot of other heritable genetic disorders that they want to cure. Cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, hemophilia. These are diseases or heritable genetic disorders that have only one or two genetic coding problems that could be fixed by CRISPR. And this is what interested me so much from a fictional point of view, because I couldn't think of anything more important than the ability to edit ourselves. And the fact that this is not too far away, I think in the next 10 years or so, we are going to start seeing these disorders being cured by genetic editing. And then the logical next question is, what else could we do? And I think the first thing that occurs to most people is, why not improve yourself or your kids? Now, this is right now not for living organisms, but if you have an embryo, and let's say you wanted to give your child 30 more years of healthy living, you might change the DAF2 gene to give it a unique mutation that is relatively rare in the natural world. But if you can edit it, you could imbue your child with 30 more healthy years of living. If you want them to have fast twitch muscle fibers, give them MEF2, a slight edit. Actually, that would have helped me, because if I'm limping, it's because I hurt my shoulder the other day. If I had MEF2, I don't think I would have been hurt. If you want to improve your child's memory, you could make an edit to DLG3. And there's a whole host of them. PCSK9 could give them healthier heart, stronger bones for different edits, on and on and on. And you can see where this is heading. Now, we're only 10 years or so out from the ability to do that. Now, is it safe? Probably not just yet. That's because we barely understand the human genome. We know these genes do this, but we don't know what else they do. And that's because I like to think of the human genome as a Word document that somebody's been working on for hundreds of thousands of years, but they never erased anything. They just cross stuff out. And that's because we have in our genomic sequence genes that aren't expressed, but they are in some ways primordial remnants of who we used to be. And so when we make an edit, we are not always aware of what other things we might be changing further down the line. But in this book, Change Agent, I wanted to explore the idea of that impulse to modify ourselves and to improve opportunities for our kids. So I envisioned a world. This is the first book I've written, by the way, that takes place in the future. It takes place in 2045. And by this time, I envisioned that black market embryo labs would be fairly common, and that they would be offering perhaps risky edits to expectant parents that want to give their children a leg up in the world. And the end result of this would be to rapidly accelerate human evolution by an order of magnitude. Now, my protagonist in this book is an Interpol agent who is tasked with trying to locate these embryo clinics and try to shut them down. And again, it's because of the risk they represent. Without a full understanding of the human genome, if we start making willy-nilly changes, the thing about CRISPR is these changes are passed down to all future generations. So there's no easy way to erase it, because if we start changing things and we didn't understand the effects of the first change we made, we start to stack up all these random changes very quickly. And that's why he tries to prevent it. I also foresee that this will be an immensely profitable activity, embryo labs. Because think about it, if you can make your child taller, have perfect vision, the temptation would be so strong to do that. And the people who would be willing to pay would find somebody willing to do it. And that's primarily because CRISPR is not a difficult thing to do. And I hesitate as I say this, but you guys could get on Google, for instance, and Google CRISPR. And for about $1,000, you could set up your own home genetic editing lab. And that's no joke, you can. I was up at a TED Summit event this summer in Banff, and everybody got to edit bacteria and imbue it with bioluminescence. And it didn't take long to learn, and it didn't take much equipment. Now, that is giving rise to a renaissance in what's called synthetic biology, that is creating synthetic organisms that are built custom. And of course, CRISPR is a tremendous tool in this. So we're building E. coli bacteria and yeasts and algae that do useful work. And it's very much like programming, because of course DNA is very much like software. But we're programming the hardware in a way. And George Church at MIT is really the father of synthetic biology. And this has gotten to the point where now there is an annual competition. Every year it's called iGEM, where undergraduate teams compete to design the coolest synthetic life form. And that is a really 21st century contest, if you ask me. It's pretty damn cool. Now, I think a lot of people might have the problem with what happens in this book, which is that one of these very profitable genetic editing cartels injects my protagonist with a serum that changes him as an adult, modifies his DNA. But 2 years ago, researchers at the University of Washington, I believe it was, they injected squirrel monkeys in the eye and imbued them with color vision. And this happened 2 years ago. So this was done by pairing CRISPR with a virus to try to propagate it through the cells. Now, researchers are starting with the eye because eyes in mammals are a relatively self-contained micro ecosystem, if you will. They don't want to have these edits spread willy-nilly throughout the body, and the eye is a fairly self-contained platform. So they've already had some really interesting successes at that. And I also like to tell people, and this is going to be harder in this room, because sometimes my crowds skew a little older, but thinking back 30 years, back in 1987, when I was much younger, we basically would go to video stores and bookstores. We'd receive newspapers and magazines at our home. We received or sought physical goods. And of course, now everyone has a portable camera computer phone that allows them to broadcast to the entire world. And that has radically transformed everything from business, economics, our human relationships. And that's a dramatic change in just 30 years. But I think the next 30 years, by 2045, 47, will make that change look minor. I think there's going to be a fourth industrial revolution of genetics and synthetic biology that is going to radically change the way we manufacture products. And of course, I think this fourth industrial revolution will be the first one where we as human beings physically change. Now, part of the thing that fascinated me also about this book, this idea of having a character change. Now, it sounds familiar because it is. It's a recurring motif throughout mythology. It's an identity switch. It's losing one's identity, changing one's face. And you can go back to Greek mythology of Zeus. You could go back to the legend of King Arthur or the Prince and the Pauper. It's both a fear and kind of an alluring idea to change yourself. And what I wanted to do in Change Agent was take this most current research and make that very realistic, to make it seem imminent and relevant to us all. Now, a lot of the time, people glance at my work and they think that I'm doomsaying or somehow pessimistic about the future. I'm actually very optimistic about the future. And that, when I look at genetic editing, I again see something like fire, a very useful tool that could hurt us, but also offers us tremendous capabilities. Again, think about the ability to cure all of these heritable genetic disorders. But more than that, set us aside for a moment, there's also cellular agriculture. And again, synthetic biology creating new ways of manufacturing, essentially biofacturing, programming E. coli bacteria or algae or yeast to do things like create biofuels or to create pharmaceuticals. And most importantly, I think, and what will cause the largest change is cellular agriculture, essentially redesigning these single-celled organisms to create things like meat. Now, right now on Earth, our ecosystem is being ravaged by meat production. 90% of the deforestation happening in the Amazon is occurring to support meat production. So we're leveling all of these forests either to create pasture or feed stocks for meat production. Now, if the human population increases to 9 or 10 billion people by 2050, that will absolutely devastate the ecosystem. And of course, more people are eating meat. Meat consumption is going up drastically. With cellular agriculture, companies can grow just the muscle tissue, not the whole cow, not the whole pig, or the whole chicken. And what this essentially does is you're recreating exactly the DNA of the meat that you consume. And the great thing about DNA is everyone can check it. It's the original open source. So you could take a look to see that that steak is genetically identical. And they're not quite there yet. But if we adopt cellular agriculture to grow meat, we use 1% of the land and only 10% of the water. So there is an ick factor. It freaks people out. But there's also the fact that if we don't do it or try it, we could completely devastate the earth. There's also other changes to crops that we can make with CRISPR. And I think the biggest single change would be creating C4 photosynthesis rice, which is already a project that's underway. Right now, rice uses C3 photosynthesis, which is less efficient. Now, a third of the population of the planet relies upon rice to survive. Corn and sugarcane use C4 photosynthesis, which is more efficient. The effort is to change the photosynthesis of rice, common strains of rice, And in doing so, it would double the production of rice and half the amount of water it needs. Otherwise, the rice would remain identical. And this is really where we get into, I think, an interesting area, which is GMOs. A lot of people are against GMOs. I've historically been against them, although for a different reason than many other people. A lot of my objection to GMOs is that they represent an intellectual property virus. That is, a certain firm might create a proprietary organism and then pair it with a whole system and then have that organism spread its genomic sequence to other heirloom varieties through natural pollination processes, and then basically sue their competition out of existence. Now that is one use of GMOs. But I think CRISPR is going to radically change the GMO situation. I think GMOs are going to go from being the purview of multi-million-dollar corporate labs to being a tool that everyone will use. Local communities, tribes, even individuals. Because remember, with CRISPR, you could set up a genetic editing lab with $1,000. Now, if we're living in a world that is rapidly heating up, climate change is causing fast changes that make pasture land or croplands unviable for traditional crops. Or if increased storms and rising seas make it difficult to keep using the crops that indigenous populations have been using, they could conceivably change them. Now, a good example goes back a few years, and if I get this name wrong, I think it's Pamela Ronald. Her group at Davis, UCLA Davis, they changed a strain of rice so that it could live 17 days under salt water. Now, they took a traditional Indian strain that had that ability. They changed a common strain of rice that was very productive, and they imbued it with that same ability. And then they gave it away. And I look at that and I find it very difficult to say that that's a bad thing to do. I mean, they're going to save hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people's lives. So GMOs and the anti-GMO movement, I think, needs to evolve, because this is going to become a very personal thing. People are going to be able to start changing organisms in ways that not only suit them, but that are imperative, because they're a life and death matter. And it won't be just a decision made behind closed doors. It might be a community decision. And a lot of this is going to start happening very soon, in coming years. Actually, I like to think of, you guys remember this classic Apple ad where the PC was the purview of, let's say, IBM. That's what it was symbolized as. And it's sort of represented as this oppressive technological environment. And then the runner comes up in full colors and shatters the screen. I think in many ways, GMOs are going to follow the same pattern, that we're going to go from this very controlled environment to rapid genetic change that's open source. And people will be freely exchanging information. So I think that's really the next great renaissance. And of course, I cover all of this in my new book, Change Agent. Now, mastery of DNA, to me, is the next great challenge for us. A lot of people talk about AI, and of course, AI is going to be important. But I think the great fuse burning for us in developing mastery of DNA is climate change. If we have methane salts melting in the Arctic and possibly changing our atmosphere, I think having the ability to modify ourselves might come in handy. So again, this could be both good and bad. And part of my incentive for writing this book, as with most of my books, is I wanted to popularize these ideas so that as many people as possible, in the process of being entertained, might also entertain some of these ideas and think, wow, that's interesting. Maybe they Google it and they find out a lot of these things are already underway. And if it does that, then that makes me absolutely happy, and I'd say that I did my job. But first and foremost, I tried to tell an exciting story. So that's my prepared talk. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, and please don't be shy.
A typical question, who are your influences in writing? What authors influence you in developing your stories? And
Okay. Well, Neil Stephenson was probably a later one, but we go back to Isaac Asimov, Andre Norton, a lot of sci-fi. Loved sci-fi, J.R.R. Tolkien, of course. And also John Dos Passos. I have an English literature degree, so I've read widely. That's why I'm sitting here trying to think, whose estate am I going to piss off by not mentioning various people? But I think probably what inspired me most to write, Carl Sagan would be one that I would say would be a huge influence to me. As a matter of fact, probably the most important influence, one of my favorite books, aside from Cosmos when I was a kid, I remember asking for Christmas, like, I want Cosmos, and my parents were looking like, that looks really boring. It's thick. And I loved it. But also Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan, which is a super relevant book now. I see you nodding your head, and it really is. And you think about that, his job, again, he set upon himself the task to popularize science, to make people understand what the big picture, what the big issues were. And I humor myself in thinking that I'm trying to do that in some way here for either cyber or other issues. My big focus in my work is I try to focus on technological change, where that's coming, where it might go. So a lot of authors who dealt with that, and I would say Carl Sagan would be a huge one. But, oh man, I could go on and on. Oh, of course, William Gibson, obviously. But I'll stop it there because I'll just keep going. Yes?
So you mentioned that genetic engineering can be something that's going to become more community-based as opposed to something big corporations do.
Yeah, I believe it is.
As we move forward towards this, what can we do to guide people to make sure that they do this in an ethical fashion as opposed to just starting to kill each other?
Yes. Okay, so the question was, and I don't know, this is probably going to come through fine because you have a microphone, but I'll recap. The question was, how can we pursue this would-be renaissance in a way that doesn't annihilate us or our neighbors or everybody else? And I would say it is going to take exactly this, a dialogue. People knowing a bit about it, seeing the news, and then talking about it. Because I've noticed this pattern, and it's really well covered in books like, I believe it's called The Master Switch by Tim Hu. This long process of ingesting new technologies for societies typically takes about 30 years. And that process of a radical new technology coming in is really fractious. People sue each other, they fight each other. And I think I would provide as an example aviation. Aviation, when it first came through, invented a new legal term, which was aerial trespass. And if you think about it, it's funny because we just think about it now like, well, people worked it out. But what happened when airplanes first started flying low and slow over people's land, very noisily, is people worried about privacy. They also didn't like people flying over their land. And more particularly, railroads, which carried mail, didn't like airmail stealing their business. Now, if you look at the shape of a railroad, it tends to be like a wall. And so they really encouraged this idea of aerial trespass, that if you cross our rail lines, you're trespassing. And so this started a series of lawsuits. And these were quickly followed by lawsuits about privacy, lawsuits about safety, product design, and on and on. The end result, after almost 30 years, was codifying this in regulations from all of those legal precedents, and that became the FAA. To which I would say to people that no matter what you think of the FAA, there's very few people who would get on an aircraft that was not certified by the FAA. So that process, fractious as it is useful. And I think we're going to see this here. It's if we don't see those arguments, if we don't see that vigorous public debate, that's when I worry. Because as long as people are directly addressing each other on this and really educating themselves on it, because I think this is actually going to be the central issue of the next 20 or 30 years, genetic editing. I mean, I can't think of anything more impactful than the ability to rapidly evolve ourselves. That would be important in everything from space exploration to dealing with climate change to dealing with pandemics, on and on and on. And then, of course, you have the eugenics questions. Like, to what degree do we change ourselves? What's acceptable? To me, it's a fascinating question, but transparency, that's what's going to stop us from killing ourselves. Now, at this moment, I'll also bring up gene drives. Now, how many people here have heard of gene drives? Got one person? No, two people, three. Or you're just pointing at your nose. Okay, never mind. Don't go to an auction, is what I'd say. A gene drive is an aspect of genetic editing that could turn into a weapon very quickly. The Pentagon is certainly concerned about gene drives. If you've heard of gene drives, you've probably heard about it in relation to Zika virus or malaria. some mosquito-borne virus. And right now, this is not a few years from now, right now as we sit here, scientists are creating a gene drive that could crash certain species of mosquitoes. And the way they do this is because through sexual reproduction, the offspring acquire approximately half of the genes from each parent. What a gene drive does is that researchers use CRISPR editing, or maybe some future type of editing, to make both those sides of the gene exchange the same thing. It doesn't even have to be from each parent. Basically, they guarantee that a certain trait is passed down to the next generation. And if you keep doing this, you could put in a fatal flaw or a way to somehow compromise that species, or you could also make it so that they don't transmit a virus. But either way, what are the unintended consequences of that? If we, let's say, crash a mosquito population, what other parts of the ecosystem is it supporting that we're not thinking about? Now remember, this can happen now. And also, the part that the Pentagon's concerned about, and other defense agencies around the world, what about angry groups, terrorist groups, creating a gene drive that implants in the human genome undesirable traits that later cause a specific weakness or a fatal flaw? And again, remember, $1,000 for a CRISPR lab. So I think it's going to be a very proximate conversation we need to start having right away. But that would just be one example of why that transparency and that open communication is going to be pivotal. Because otherwise, I think we do have some things to worry about.
So you seem very well informed. I'm very excited to read this book. And I was just curious, how much of your time did you spend researching, and where did you learn about all this?
Okay. I've found a pattern with my books. Typically what happens is, by the way, in case it didn't come through in audio, the question was, how much time do I spend researching a book, and where do I learn these types of things? I will start by saying, Google is really handy. and this is not entirely an answer to your question, which I'll continue to, but Google Earth is probably the single best writer's research tool ever, because it has saved me a hell of a lot of money in airfare, because I'll go to a location and say, no, that's not right. I could even do street view in some place in Bangladesh. Very useful. Now, I spend approximately a third of the time required to write a book doing research. For me, and I'm sure this is different for every writer, but for me, it's basically a third of my time conceiving of the story and its structure and its characters, a third of the time doing research, and a third of the time actually writing the book. And you can tell I've worked in software before, because I organize everything very carefully. I don't say it's not prose reuse, but it's efficient. And that means that by the time I'm ready to set pen to paper to start writing, I typically don't backtrack a lot. And so what I'll do is I will have some idea that has taken hold of me, typically. And genetic editing is a good example. Lethal autonomy for my book Kill Decision is another example. Whatever the idea is that I have for a book, it's typically one that I'm imagining whenever I close my eyes when I go to sleep at night. And if it won't let me go, I know that it's an idea I have to write a book about. And then I will start thinking about, what is the big issue here that I'm most concerned about? And that's really where I'll root my research, and it will spread from there. Typically, during the research process, I will discover so many new cool things that I'll go in different directions. But to me, it's very important that I stop doing that by the time I write, because I try to make these several threads, A, B, and C thread of the story, and I like to have them interweave at the right moments. And if you change things willy-nilly, it doesn't work out too well. So I try to do all my significant changes during the research and the structure component. And lots of reading, by the way. Read lots of books. That's why at the end of every single book I've written, there is a reading list. And if you just flip through it, I guarantee you'll find some interesting books, because they're typically the books that were most pivotally important to me in the writing of the book. Yes?
So the reason that CRISPR-Cas9 is in the news right now is because of a huge legal fight over its patent rights.
Yes.
So what leads you to believe that this IBM world is going to get smashed, as opposed to continuing on kind of as it has been?
Oh, yeah, that lawsuit. See, I look at it this way. There is the lawsuit over who invented CRISPR, which is, I believe, what you're referring to. Now, I think they settled one portion of it already, which to me, now, of course, there's several other issues. It is so valuable, I think, that there is a lot of external pressures saying, look, nobody's going to make serious investments until we get this little matter of who invented it solved. And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to solve it, and a lot of money will be offered to various parties to settle. I'm going to boldly make that prediction. I don't think it's that bold, actually. But there's also the simple matter that CRISPR and how it works is generally known. And like I said, you can get a hold of tools. If you're not running some registered lab where you're selling a product, that kind of changes things. If you're not selling, let's say, software and you're writing code, people can take all sorts of liberties in where that code came from, because it's very difficult to say who's doing what. And whether that's right or wrong, I think the impetus will be that a lot of people will start messing around with this technology because it's so simple to use. And I think the way it will start is in designing E. coli bacteria or yeast or algae to do cool things. And I think that's really where people are going to cut their teeth. So regardless of what legal case is going on, I think that's what's going to drive it. And familiarity with the tools will make people come up with a killer app. Now, whether that killer app is literal or figurative, I think it remains to be seen. Hey, I know you.
Yeah. Well, Pasadena. So speaking of places in the U.S., your book is not one of them. The locations are in other parts of the world, in Singapore and Myanmar, and I want you to talk a little bit about why you selected these parts of the world.
So this book, Change Agent, does not take place in America, and this is not the only one of my books that doesn't, but there is a particular passage in this book that has some people concerned, I'll say, or at least they've mentioned it to me, and that is that by 2045, Silicon Valley is dead. It's like a lot of emails like, what is that supposed to mean? What it is an admonition. It is an admonition to America to engage with reason and logic and science. And if we don't, the rest of the world will. That it's not an option. That we can fall back and lose our place as the cutting edge of technology. And that's really why it's there. I think that a great many parts of the world that are dealing with climate change right now know it's not a hoax. And there's a drive to question science and to muddy the waters here that I find really worrisome. And so I wanted to perhaps model what the world would look like if that continued. And I think anybody who's an American reading this would probably realize that this is quite possible, this world of 2045. Does that mean all Americans do not use science? No. It does mean that the best and the brightest might go to Singapore or to other countries where their skills are used very well and they have a good future. And it would be great if we could have that future here. But just so you know, Singapore I chose because back in, I think it was 2006, I might have that wrong by a year or so, they spent $1 billion creating something called Biopolis, which is a biotech hub. It's a lab, it's a big lab complex, and they wanted to lure the best geneticists and biotech talent around the world to come and work unfettered in these beautiful modern labs to create an infrastructure for what they felt was going to be the next big tech revolution. And I tend to agree with them. Now that's a serious investment to make for that tiny nation. So that's why I chose Singapore.
You talked about protecting ourselves from unethical or malicious behavior. How do you see us competing in competence or stupidity in this? Like, if anybody can access this tech and anybody can augment E. coli, it's not uncommon for a chemistry lab in high school to
Not at all
blow
uncommon,
up,
yeah.
or alcohol bootleg to produce methanol. Well, if this is now an E. coli with unintended gene drive, some hilarities might ensue. So
what controls are in place? I believe that's what you're asking, right? Essentially, this is an E. coli bacteria is one of the most common organisms there is. As a matter of fact, you can get on the web and from various sites you can purchase a stripped down version of E. coli And again, I may have it wrong by 1 or 2 genes, but I think it's 268 genes that they've reduced an E. coli bacteria down. And all it does, all of this organism does, is maintain itself and reproduce itself. It doesn't do anything. And the idea is you buy this and you give it a purpose. You make it do something. Let's say produce a pharmaceutical or a biofuel. I've seen prototype products that they take an E. coli bacteria that, let's say, consumes sunlight and sugar and produces something that feeds another E. coli bacteria, which produces a biofuel, a sort of a step-by-step. Normally, they wouldn't feed into each other's processing loops, but somebody's modified them so they do. Another very interesting project that I saw, which is, you can see a TED Talk on this. Of course, I don't remember off the top of my head, but you could Google it. It is an art project where they programmed organisms to grow chitin. That is the shell that mollusks and others have. The idea is we could conceivably grow car fenders. So instead of having a factory that produces in very carbon-intensive fashion fenders, you could produce biodegradable fenders that are pre-painted because, you know, a lobster has a color. Well, we could just give it a different color. But all of those skills, as you point out, and the wide availability of E. coli bacteria, the fact that you can just order it from online, does make it very risky. That we might see people designing custom organisms that could do great harm. And the only thing I can tell you is that's why you definitely want society to be equitable. Because the more unjust a society is, I think the more likely that's going to happen. It, to me, shows just how rare that type of activity is. The fact that it isn't constantly happening. It does happen, but it's not widely common. And given how common all of these components are, and how relatively easy it is to learn how to use them, it's actually miraculous that it doesn't happen. I do think we'll start to see more of it, but it's, if anything, a good incentive for us to have a more just society as a whole. Yes.
Okay, hi. So I should say that I'm very impressed by the level of research you've done
Cool.
for this book.
Thanks.
That's not usually the case. But I want to say one thing that I disagree with one kind of assumptions you're making here.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So I think that the general notion of genetic editing or genetic engineering, more broadly biological engineering, I consider extremely dangerous. And no matter how much we discuss it, there is an inherent complexity here. Mm-hmm. That is usually being overlooked. And it's kind of what I'm saying is that inherently complex in a way that it might be impossible to compute or
like unintended consequences are very likely.
And I can use so I'm a physicist by training. I can use like various different biology, physics, and computer science description of the problem. First, biologically, in the 4 billion years of evolutionary biology, like from the first photosynthetic system to right now what we are, the system has always evolved in close to equilibrium. So it's like changes are very slow, and the entire ecosystem has the time to respond. So because we are talking about a complex system.
And death is usually involved in that process, Darwinian selection.
Exactly. But it's like since the Homo sapiens, potentially like a kind of big changes, cognitive ability 80,000 years ago, we, even in the Stone Age, we already destroyed, before even agricultural revolution, we destroyed half of mammals.
Yeah, all the large herbivores disappeared.
Yeah, large mammals, half of them were destroyed. And during the agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, we are destroying, extincting, in a daily basis, on the order of thousands.
Well, 40% of species are supposed to be extinct at this rate by 2050.
Exactly.
40%.
Yeah. So, once you introduce this kind of genetic engineering or editing, and including various different kind of other industries that nanotechnology, AI, this combination of things drives the system such out of equilibrium that there is no response time to any of the biological, the natural biological things to respond. And the system, to downplay this is like some people, policymaker, can sit in a room and figure this out. This is very naive.
You know what this is? To me, and I'll absolutely let you continue. It's not even a choice. This is already happening. When we say to allow this to happen. Again, these tools are so readily available. What you're doing right now is exactly what I would love to have happen. That is, people calling for caution and maybe taking action, because the truth is these tools are so readily available. Nothing short, I mean, failing that, and there will be corners of the world where this happens anyway. So please continue.
So the last statement I want to make that is connecting with the audience here is that the solutions to this kind of problems, to predicting, or trying to even project any kind of outcome would be near impossible because, as far as P is not MP. So it's like these are worst case, we are approaching worst case MP hard problems. And unless, like what I'm saying is that people who think that they can predict this thing are extremely naive. So what I'm saying is that there might be serious consequences, unintended, forget about intended consequences, unintended consequences, because like the combinatory possibilities is just beyond evaluation, basically. That's what I'm saying.
And the reason I'm not disagreeing with you is that is basically most of what my book's about.
Okay.
Is those unintended consequences. And when I stand here and say that I'm optimistic about the future, the only reason I say that is we have the ability to annihilate the human race. All creatures on Earth, and we've had that ability for half a century, and we haven't done it yet. And I'm with you. I hear you. There's a tremendous amount of hubris that might come into play here where we think we can play God, and we're just, still toddlers at it. But at the same time, I know the tools are out there, and a lot of these changes, rapid editing, are going to occur. So whether that's people using supercomputing to do bioinformatics to try to understand genetics and how all of these things connect, I think it is going to be a race against time. And your concern actually is, I think, well-founded. But I do think this is going to start to happen regardless. And so I would love everybody in this room to get involved and to pay attention to what's going on. And you'll see just how concerned I am, not to force you to read the book, but there's a great deal in there. This is why I'm sometimes called a doomsayer. People say, oh, come on, Dan, you're ruining the fun. I like to think of what I do in my books. This is why they're thrillers, by the way, is because there's typically a perilous outcome at stake. I like to think what I do is spot icebergs. And it's much better to prototype the future in fiction than it is to run into it blind. And I'm not saying let's all abandon ship. I'm saying let's turn a little to the right, turn a little to the left. And that's basically what I try to do. So I agree with you. I think you're dead on. And I guess we'll see what happens.
So my question is more along the lines of writing, the writing side of things.
Okay.
So one of the reasons I came to your last talk here as well, and one of the reasons that I really like your books and like these talks is that you're really obviously very interested in all of this stuff, really intellectually, like you can tell when you're up there talking about this, you're like, this is really cool.
Oh yeah, I do.
So I'm kind of curious. Obviously, you've bounced around to a lot of very different, very interesting topics in their own way, and we're on the genetic editing side of things. Obviously at some point you'll be picking up something for your next book. How when does that transition for you?
Okay.
Because
it's already occurred. I'm already.
So you're already moving on.
Yeah, that's why I have to be careful not to mention things that don't happen in this book. But that's the way it is. There's a saying that you have your whole life to write your first book, and you have a year to write your second one. And it's typically because if you've done it right and you've managed to break through, they're like, oh great, do another one. And I've been fortunate with my publisher, Dutton, as part of Penguin Random House, that I've just been able to really focus on the writing. And they've been always there to back me up and give me a new book deal. And I always have something else that I'm interested in. A lot of people have asked me, like with Demon and Freedom TM were the first two books that I did, that focused on cyber security and other issues, really a lot more than that, whether I would do another one of those books. And what I typically say is I may, but I have such wide-ranging interests that I would hate to just stay writing the same books again and again, because I don't want to go too many times to the well, but also I want to keep my fascination fresh. And there's just so many interesting, risky, cool, and provocative things going on with technology in the world and how it impacts society that this becomes a dream job for me, to be able to go around and try to think about what I want to write and then have the opportunity to do it is great. So I never run out of stuff so far to write, and that's why I tend to write different books every time as opposed to another sequel. So, I don't know.
Can you,
Hopefully
can you
that
give us a
answered it.
hint on what's coming next?
What's
or-
that?
Can you give us a hint on what's coming next?
Well, actually, I can tell you why I won't. The world has changed a bit. There's a couple reasons why I don't. I think the first reason I don't is I found, and maybe you find this too, that when you want to write a story and you start telling your friends about it, that you find that you take more and more time talking about it than actually doing it. And this was very much the case for Demon when I wrote it when I was not a professional writer. I could spend some of my free time talking about it, or I could do it. And I found if I prohibited myself from talking about it and instead wrote it, and I could only talk about it when it was done, that worked out much better for me. There was also a commercial aspect of it, which is if I mention what I'm writing, there might be a super short novella up on Amazon 3 days from now about that. So that's just a reality of the modern world. And I really do like to try to preserve the originality or the impact of what I'm writing. So those two things work together for me to say no comment. Sorry. Anybody else? Any questions at all? Good questions, man. All right, I think. Oh, yes.
You said most of your books are based on the ideas that doesn't allow you to sleep at night. What are a couple ideas that you discarded?
That's a great question. So since you weren't at the microphone, the question was if what I write about comes from ideas that won't let me go, let's say. It's not that I won't sleep at night. It's typically when my mind is in its passive resting state, my mind immediately goes back to that thing. What are some examples of ideas that I did not write about? See, this goes into my Google search history and security watch lists. I, for a while, had some difficulty getting back into the country without interested people wanting to talk to me. And this has been sorted out since. I have a very alarming Google search history. Typical day for me would involve shape charges, sniper rifles, bioweapons, just on and on. And a lot of ideas that involve innovative ways to cause harm are ideas that I tend to go away. They might fascinate me for a while, but I don't want to be too instructive. Because I think my problem is I was a D&D moderator for about 10 years, and I can make traps that are very devious. So I don't want to go too deep into that territory. Those are typically the ideas that I abandon looking at that saying, oh my God, how awful I'll feel if some person says, yes, that's it, and they run out and start to do that. That would be bad. So that's my answer. Yes? No, I spend a lot of time doing that, but I think I'm beyond that. Also, there's proxies, there's Tor, and on and on. But see, now I have to worry less about it because I think they know me, and it's like, oh no, it's just Dan. It's fine, it's not a terrorist. Yes?
What books are you reading now?
Okay, this ought to alarm everybody. I'm about halfway through the 6th extinction. It's very cheerful reading, but that's why I knew that about 40% of the species in the world were going to be wiped out by 2050 if we don't change what we're doing. What other books have I read? All the Light We Cannot See I read recently. There's such a beautiful book. I sometimes like to read real literary fiction, which is very different from what I do, where each sentence and paragraph is very beautiful and evocative. I will admit that's not what I do. My books tend to be about ideas. I also find it much more relaxing to read books that are in a genre that I don't write, because otherwise, if I read another tech thriller, I tend to look for the scaffolding all the time, or say, oh, no, I would have put this here, and it takes you out of the story all the time. So, also Name of the Wind I read recently, Patrick Rothfuss, which I really liked. Again, fantasy, I could just kind of relax and enjoy it. So, yes.
So as people begin body hacking and modifying themselves with genes, do you feel that we might become more diverse or more homogenous as people start just altering themselves?
Oh, that's a great question. So again, the question was, will we become more diverse and more homogenous as a result? And I think the web is super instructive with this regard. If you remember the early days of the web, there was this profusion, this websites all over. And then what happened was these certain portals started to develop, and one comes to mind. But it's interesting how initially there is this great profusion. But then almost a culture builds around it, and people start to create a vocabulary and a language, and they start to aggregate towards common themes. And I think if we have the ability to genetically edit ourselves, I don't know whether it'll become Second Life, or whether people will say, oh, I really like that. Like fashion, like clothing. I mean, I think clothing is probably a perfect example. We wear different enough things, but I didn't come here in a suit of armor or as a Shakespearean character. And I don't think the trend is for people to be that different. Now, that's my instinct on it. I might be wrong, but I think people will see the reaction other people get. I think tastes and mores might affect it. So I think initially we'll see a great profusion as people try things out, but then concerns with health, unintended consequences, and other things will cause people to do sort of the mall version of a lizard person. It's like, well, it's just the skin. I'm still the same underneath. So that's probably the weirdest answer to that question you were thinking you get. All right. Anybody else? I'm having fun, so. Anybody? All right. I think das ist alles. Thank you.